being here on the stormy day. I know it's tough to get outside in weather like that. So I know most of you, but if I don't know you, welcome. My name is Tyler Denmead. I'm a fellow and director of studies in education at Queens College, and it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Amilcar Pereira to Queens College on behalf of the Education Society here at Queens. Before I introduce Dr. Pereira, I just want to say a few things. This talk will last around 15 minutes or so. You will be hard-pressed to believe, but this room gets transformed into a badminton court, and badminton begins at 6. So we're going to leave here at 6. I know, amazing. And I welcome all of you, if you'd like to congregate in the Q bar afterwards and socialize. There's a cash bar there. And there's a guitar over there because Dr. Pereira was a professional musician, was. And he was warming up before you got here, singing and playing. It was fantastic. So maybe he'll perform for us a little bit in the Q bar at 6. Okay. I also just wanted to acknowledge Dr. Catherine Muller, who's not here with us this evening, but she was instrumental in organizing this talk, and she's really sad that she couldn't be here, but we're grateful to her for introducing Dr. Pereira to Queens. Okay, so Dr. Pereira is an associate professor of history education in the Faculty of Education at Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, where he teaches in graduate and undergraduate courses on race relations and Afro-Brazilian histories. He also coordinates the research group on anti-racist education. He is the author of many articles and books, including the 2013 book, The Black World, Racial Relations and the Constitution of the Black Movement in Brazil, and the 2021 book, which I believe is right here, Narratives of Reexistence, Anti-Racism, History, and Education, both in Portuguese. Amilcar is currently a British Academy visiting professor in Cambridge's Faculty of Education. His project, Anti-Racism in Education, History, Social Movements, and Knowledge Production in Universities in Brazil and the UK, contributes to transnational understandings of Black diasporic struggles in the field of education. He's exploring how the histories of anti-racist struggles in the UK and Brazil have created the terrain for potential changes in racial relations in recent decades. The project focuses on the role of elite universities like the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro and University of Cambridge in these struggles for a more just future in two countries with distinct yet interrelated colonial histories of enslavement. The project combines archival research on the Black movement's history in UK with oral history interviews with Black leaders, including with students and faculty of the University of Cambridge who are engaged in anti-racist activities on campus. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Pereira here to Queens to discuss this topic.
Well, I would like to start thanking Professor Tyler and Professor Catherine Muller. Unfortunately, she can't be here today, but she was fundamental she actually made it possible for me to come as a visiting professor to Cambridge, so I'm really grateful to Professor Catherine, and I hope she's going to be better very soon. Well, I'm going to start talking with you about colonialism and racism, starting from a transnational perspective. I'm going to focus on this presentation more in the history and the activism against racism in Brazil. But everything I'm going to say here is, you can understand, you can see through this transnational perspective, because racism, as long as the idea of race, are products of the colonialism. So the same colonialism, the process of colonialism that made it possible the accumulation of wealth in the Western European societies in the modernity, is the same colonialism that made it possible the creation of the modern idea of race, and then the racism, and it affects the whole world, especially in the 19th century through the imperialism, the Western European imperialism. So one cannot think about the impacts, the effects of the colonialism and the racism in a specific nation or in a specific territory, because it was a transnational process, which means that when we think about colonialism, we think about the transformations of the whole world in the last 3 or 4 centuries, and including the development of the capitalism, the modern capitalism as we know nowadays. And this sentence, I took this picture, it's a picture, I took this picture in the entrance of the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool last week. I'm trying to understand, as Professor Tyler said, the black activism against racism, and especially in the area of education here in UK, because I've been doing research on the black movement in Brazil for a long time, about 20 years now. And when I got there to the International Slavery Museum, because colonialism is also what made it possible the creation of the transatlantic slavery system in the last 4 centuries, in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. So when I got to the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool, I saw this sentence, and I took this picture, and I thought it would be perfect to start our conversation using this sentence from William Prescott. And through the presentation, I'm going to come back to this sentence, because it shows 2 very important things in my point of view to think about colonialism, racism, and also anti-racism, especially in the area of education. When you think, he's talking about buying and selling living people, human beings. So you can see all the violence of colonialism through the slavery system, and he's talking also about the importance of memory, how memory is important, and how the black people enslaved in Africa and brought to different parts of the world, they sell it, being sold, being bought as things, how they understood, they historically understand the importance of memory. They will remember that we were sold, but not that we were strong. They will remember that we were bought, but not that we were brave. William Prescott. And the people from the museum say, we will remember. I hope we remember. We remember Stephen Lawrence. We remember George Floyd. So it's been 30 years since the murder, the assassination of Stephen Lawrence in London. You probably have heard about this, but 3 years ago, the assassination of George Floyd, both cases of racial violence, linking all this transnational perspective, not only on when you think about racism, but also about anti-racism, because the murder of Stephen Lawrence and the murder of George Floyd happened in different contexts, in different times, in different places. They had enormous impact in the black movement in different parts of the world, because everybody was in the streets fighting racism after these 2 terrible episodes of racial violence. And I went to Liverpool, as I told you, last week, and I did an interview with an important black leader from Liverpool, Jimmy Jagney, and I was he was telling me about an episode of violence he suffered in 1978, when he was a 14 years old young man coming back from the school, going to home, and a car of the policeman attacked him, and he was so surprised because the police should protect him, and he was doing nothing. He was just coming back from the school with the clothes from the school, And they took him to another place, and he was so scared. And he started thinking about racism, about the importance of struggle against racism, fighting racism after this violence, racial violence episode he suffered in 1978. But in Brazil, in the same year of 1978, it was the creation of the Unified Black Movement, the Movimento Negro Unificado, which is the most important black organization in the second half of the 20th century. It's a big organization. It can be found in different parts of Brazil. And it was created in 1978 exactly because of the murder of a black young man in a street of São Paulo, supposedly because he was stolen an apple in a fair in the street. So he was brought by the policemen to the police station, and they killed this young man. He was 18 in that time, just because he was a black man. So the racial violence linked to colonialism and racism happened not only here or in the US, but in Brazil and in different parts of the African diaspora, especially in the 20th century. So I think we have to think about this 20th century, and I brought here a reflection, a theoretical reflection, an epistemological reflection I would like to share with you about the 20th century. So W.B. Du Bois, one of the most important intellectuals of the black movement in the early 20th century, in the beginning of the 20th century, he said in his book, The Souls of Black Folks, it's a very important book, in 1903, so in the beginning of the 20th century, he said, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. Eric Hobsbawm, by the other side, on the other side, you probably know, it's a very famous historian, a British historian, and very well known and very important historian. He says that in writing the end of the 20th century, in 1994, he says that the 20th century is short. It would be the years from the outbreak of the First World War and to the collapse of the USSR. So a short 20th century, comparing to the long 20th century, 19th century, the long 19th century. He studied and published a lot of books about the 19th century. So there are two interpretations of the 20th century here. For W.B. Du Bois, the 20th century would be absolutely marked by racism. Hobsbawm, on the other side, in more than 500 pages, uses the word racism only 9 times, almost always mentioning the racism of Hitler, the Nazi racism. To the Brazilian historiographer, the Eurocentric bias has been the norm, just like in the works of Hobsbawm and many other Europeans and American historians. So it has been the denial of the importance of racism in the structuring of Brazilian society historically. And I've been learning a lot, talking to many people here. I've done some interviews here, and it's similar. This denial of the importance of race and racism to the formation, to the historical formation of the societies, not only in Brazil, but also here in UK and in parts of Europe. So I'm proposing an epistemological change using the breaking of temporal conventions and the relativization of chronological time made by Hobsbawm, which I think is brilliant, and using the Du Bois statement of on the importance of racism, and in my opinion also the importance of anti-racism, to think about the historical formation of Brazilian society in the period of time between 1989, which is just after the abolition of the slavery in Brazil. Brazil was the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery. It was only 1888. So in Brazil, we started a republic in 1889 and established a racial policy in the beginning of the republic in Brazil, as I'm going to show you. So between 1889 and nowadays in Brazil, in my opinion, we are living in this long 20th century of the color line in Brazil. We are still living. despite the fact that the black movement achieved some important changes in Brazilian society during the last decades. We won't have the time, but I really would like to listen to you about what you think in the UK in terms of race relations here. In Brazil, you can see in the 21st century, the homicides against black population just increases. And I'm going to talk about more of this. So the racial violence we saw in 1978 with the murder of that young man, which was the motivation, gave the motivation of the creation of this important organization in 1978 in Brazil during the military dictatorship. We had a military dictatorship from 1964 to 1985 for more than 20 years. In that period, the creation of the Unified Black Movement was very important. It was caused by the violence against the black population. So the numbers increases in the 20th century. You see there's no okay, no problem. You can see the graphics. You see how in the 21st century the numbers are increasing. So much more black young men have been murdered in Brazil, and the data it's so terrible. It's difficult to say for me. In 2017, so 5 to 6 years ago, more than 70,000 black young men from 15 years old to 24 years old were murdered in Brazil in 1 year. It was a black young man murdered in Brazil each 26 minutes in the year of 2017. Can you imagine the dimension of this violence? So when I finished this talk, 2 black young men were murdered in Brazil in this period of time. So it's something unbelievable. It is happening every day in Brazilian society. But when you think about the access to school and education, the average schooling by color or race in Brazil during the whole 20th century, when you think about the race relations in education, the gap between the average schooling of white men and women comparing to the black population, you see the gap remains the whole 20th century. So if there is no public policies to fight racism in education, the inequality remains, and it's a mark of the 20th century. So I'm affirming here that there is a racial policy in Brazil. A racial policy that started with colonialism, right? Brazil was colonized by Portugal, and we became an independent empire in 1822. And the majority of the population was black people. And I say why? I don't know if you know, but Brazil received about 5 million enslaved people from Africa. So the second biggest population of African descent in the whole world is Brazil, Brazilian society. Only Nigeria has more black people than Brazil. So Brazil is a big country. We are more than 220 million people. So 56% of the Brazilian population is made up of black people. So it's more than 120 million people in Brazil. So in the 19th century, the majority of the population were black. So in the first republic, in the beginning of the republic in Brazil in 1989, so one of the first law opened Brazil to migrants, but for Africans and Asians, because they were trying to create this process of whitening the nation, especially during the First Republic. So I said 5 million enslaved people from Africa brought to Brazil in 300 years of the slavery transatlantic trade, right? In less than 40 years, in the beginning of the Republic in Brazil, about 3.5 million European people were migrated to Brazil, and about the half part, about 2 million people subsidized by the Brazilian governments to make it possible to whitening the nation. So the biggest first public policy in the First Republic in Brazil was the migration policy. So was a racial policy, an attempt to create a white nation in Brazil. And this was, this was used to explain to the population, not only in Brazil, but in international forums, the project of Brazil. It would be through miscegenation to make it possible to widen the nation. This painting from Modesto Brocos was used by João Batista de Lacerda, the director of the most important scientific institution in Brazil at that moment, the National Museum. He came to the first Universal Congress of the Races here in London, and he brought this painting to present his thesis on the colors of Brazil. And he was saying that the mixed Brazil of nowadays has in whitening in one century its perspective and solution, using the Brocos painting and with a caption, the Negro becoming white in the third generation by the mixing of races. So Marisa Correia, a very important professor from University of Ana, the Unicamp in São Paulo, she said in her famous book, As Ilusões da Liberdade, she said, before being thought in terms of culture or in economic terms, the nation, the Brazilian nation, was thought in terms of race. So this attempt to widen the nation was not only about the complexion, the phenotype of the population. They developed this racial policy to widen the culture of the Brazilian population. So there is this very important book from this American historian, Jerry Davila, Diploma of Whiteness. It was translated into Portuguese, and it's a very important book. He was showing how the public policy on education, the whole educational system was being built in Brazil during the First Republic as a kind of hospital to heal the race. And when you see the Federal Constitution of 1934, which was the first democratic constitution created in Brazil, in the Republic, it said there in the Federal Constitution that the Brazilian states and municipalities should encourage eugenics education. I'm sure you know what eugenics is all about. It's a kind of fake science from the 19th century, used by Goebbels, by Hitler, and many people in different parts of the world, in an attempt to better the race. So eugenics, it's something just terrible, because you understood. I said Hitler name, you say you know it's terrible. And it was in our federal constitution, and saying that the education should be engaged in this movement of eugenics, which is something really unbelievable. But it didn't work. It didn't work. It was impossible. As I told you, the majority of the population is made up of blacks. So it was just crazy, racist ideas in the First Republic, in this dream of becoming a European society in Brazil. So it was just not possible. So in the 1940s, they created the power in Brazil, which is white. They created another solution. We would not be white anymore, but they create this idea of racial democracy. And the most interesting is that this idea of racial democracy was used with more support by the Brazilian state during the military dictatorship, as I told you, from 1964 to 1985. So it was not a democracy, it was a dictatorship, but they used the idea of racial democracy as a matter of national identity. And it was a law, the National Security Law, with an article prohibiting anybody to talk about racism in Brazil. If you talk about racism in Brazil during the military dictatorship, you would be in jail, just to talk about racism in that period, because it was a matter of a national identity. Racism, there was only in the US or South Africa. Brazil was a racial democracy. So following this line, there would be not racial prejudice in Brazil, and the black backward position would be an exclusive consequence of slavery. Which makes the things really hard, really difficult to the black movement in Brazil, because if there was no racism, why to create a black movement in Brazil? So this is something really important nowadays. Many people believe in Brazil until today that there is a kind of racial democracy in Brazil. But you saw the numbers, the black people being murdered every day in huge numbers in Brazilian society. So racism is there, structuring the relations between people, among people in Brazilian society and in many parts of the world. It's a transnational phenomenon. So how to imagine and build a new world without racism? This is one of the most important challenges we have as society in this period we are living in. So I think, inspired by the poetry, I choose this sentence from a poet, a Mexican poet, Octavio Paz, who says in a book, this sentence for me is brilliant. I really think this is a brilliant sentence. It's a simple one and really brilliant. He says, the plurality of pasts make the plurality of futures plausible. When you know the plurality of past, you understand that the life we live in, the social life, the way we see the world, the way we read the world, like Paulo Freire used to say, it's a construction. It was built by men and women in time and space. So it's not natural. If it's not natural, and if we make history every day, we can create different futures, including futures without racism. So to understand the past and the plurality of past, the different ways people lived, people related to each other, people related to the world, it's fundamental to walk and to create something new. It's I'm going to give a drop of African wisdom. The Adinkra Sankofa. Do you know the Adinkra Sankofa? That symbol. The people, the Ashanti people, actually the Akan peoples, and the Ashanti people, especially in Ghana, in part of Western Africa, they didn't have the letters and the vocabulary, the grammar we have, but they had this group of symbols which they used to teach about many things. Sankofa is one of the symbols they call Adinka. Sankofa, actually, I remember in the place where George Floyd was murdered in 2020, I went to there and I gave a lecture. It was an important moment to me, with a lot of social movement leaders and the people there. And I saw in the very place where George Floyd was murdered, there is a Sankofa painted in the wall there. So it's a transnational symbol used to make us to think about the importance of the past, because the black movement understood, like William Prescott, the former enslaved, I quoted here, the importance of the memory to make it possible to change the future. So the Sankofa is a bird who walks ahead but look back. The bird who walks ahead but look back. Return to the past to give new meaning to the present and to build the future. This is something really, really, really important to the black movement all around the world. And this wisdom in the symbol, it's an important source for us to think about the importance of the past to build the new future. Not only the past, the action gives new meaning to the present, look into the past to build the future. And this is, when I think the plurality of past, I think this map is great. I used this in this book. I'm going to show again later this map, because for me it's remarkable. You see, this map was produced in Western Europe, in what is nowadays Italy, by a European in the 16th century, in 1512. And this is a very important historical map for the Brazilian society because it is the first world map with the name Brazil written. You see there, Brazil in the north. It's the first world map with Brazil written. So it was bought by the Brazilian government in the early 20th century, and it is in a permanent exhibition in the foreign minister there in Brazil. And you see, in the 16th century, Europe was not the center of the world. You could see the world differently. And as you know, the world's not flat, right? Everybody knows that. In Brazil, there are people now believing that it's flat, but it's not. So it's a ball, kind of ball, and it's in this movement, and in the, I can't translate it because my basic geography. So in Portuguese, we say rotação e translação. Can you translate it for me? So it's a ball, and when you say what's the north, what is the south, it's a matter of representation. You can represent the reality in different ways. So in Europe, in the 16th century, a very important man, because probably he was a very important man, we have this historical source until today, so he probably had some fame in that moment. He could see the world differently. Europe was not the center. There is a plurality of past. If I ask you, for example, what is the oldest university in the world? And when I ask this, everybody says a European city or European university, but it's not true. The oldest university was created in Morocco, in Africa, and it was created by a woman, Fatima Al-Fihiri, and she was a refugee woman. So take it to your house and think about this when you arrive at home. The oldest university was created by an African woman, and she was a refugee. So think about this. I think it's a great information for today. So the plurality of pasts, the anti-racist struggle in history and education. As I told you, when you think about the sentence of William Prescott, the importance of memory, the Black movement understood, and I've been doing research on the Black movements in US and Brazil for a long time, as I said. The Black movement understood that if the Black lives doesn't matter in curricula, in school, it's much more difficult to convince, to make the societies understand that the Black lives matter. So to take these memories, these histories, and these other possibilities of producing knowledge created by Black people through history, if you don't bring this to schools, to the curricula, it's really difficult to make the society understand that the Black lives matter. And I love this sentence from Amilcar Cabral. It's not me. Actually, I don't know if you are aware, Amilcar Cabral was one of the most important leaders of the world in the 20th century. He was an African leader, and he was someone recognized as an important leader from north to south. When he was murdered, there was a headline in the New York Times saying the death for a symbol of hope. Amilcar Cabral was celebrated in US and in USSR in the period of the Cold War. He was a very, very important African and world leader in the 20th century. He was murdered by the colonizers, the Portuguese colonizers, in 1974. 1974. But he was an intellectual. He wrote a lot of books, and he helped a lot to the development of the anti-racist struggle in the world, because his books were translated into English, into French. He wrote in Portuguese. He spoke Portuguese. He studied in Portugal. And Amilcar Cabral was called by Paulo Freire, another very important educator. Paulo Freire used to call Amilcar Cabral as the educator of the revolution. I would talk more about this, but I don't have the time. And Amilcar Cabral used it to say that the political struggle is a cultural fact. All the political struggles happens in culture, because for him the culture is a dynamic synthesis of the social life, of the life we live in. So it's a synthesis, but it's dynamic, because culture is always movement. Culture is not stopped in time and space. We are always creating. And he understood, Amilcar Cabral understood, that the political struggle is at the same time a cultural fact and a cultural factor. When you are in the struggle, you are producing new ways of seeing things, of understanding the world, new signs, new possibilities. So you change, you produce new culture. So this dynamic synthesis is changing through the struggle made by people like you and me. And Paulo Freire used it to say that to educate is a political act. There is no neutrality. If you are educating, you are acting politically. So if you understand that through political struggle, you can produce new culture and understand the plurality of pasts, maybe we can together produce new culture, new possibilities of being, of producing knowledge, of being happy in this world we are living in here, changing and transforming our future. So it's really important to take the Black memories in educational process. But not only, this is something I've been studying for a long time. In many different places where I was talking about this, people understood that I was talking only about the resistance. So anti-racism, anti-racist, it's not about the resistance, not about to respond racism and to respond oppression, to answer to that difficult situation. Anti-racism is also, in my point of view, a possibility of creating new worlds, of creating other possibilities of being in the world, not only resisting but re-existing, but creating other possibilities, creating other worlds. And this is a song from Emicida, a very famous rapper in Brazil nowadays, and in his song called São Pixinguinha, he says that, sabe onde o Brasil nunca foi colônia? Na flauta do Pixinguinha. You know where Brazil was never a colony? On the flute of Pixinguinha, of Alfredinho do Catumbi. Because the black Brazilian population was creating, was producing, and was not only resisting, was also re-existing, producing new ways, new possibilities, new possibilities of being in a better situation, in a better world. And I love this. Conceição Evaristo, she's now like an Orisha. She's very important, one of the most important writers in Brazil nowadays. And she wrote one of the chapters of my last book, the book I edited. And in this book, she says, and I love this sentence, she says that thinking about this plurality of past, she says, the Brazilian nation should return to quilombola praxis as a paradigm of struggle. The Quilombola saga can inspire our process of struggle, of re-existence. What means Quilombola? Quilombo, do you know what means Quilombo? Quilombo is a Maroon community. It's a community created by the enslaved people who were able to escape. So they ran away from the farm and they created this other society. So there were quilombos, very big quilombos in Brazil, but small quilombos too. But the question Conceição makes us think in this book, in this chapter in the book, is that the quilombolas, the people who created these quilombos, they didn't know what would happen if they escaped the slavery. They didn't know. The life would be worse, could be worse there, because they could be hungry, because they didn't know if they would find food, and they could be caught again by the slavers, the slave owners. So the life which was miserable before could be worse when they returned to the farm because there were a lot of repression. So they didn't know what would happen, but they escaped, and they were always in group. There is no quilombo of one person. If it's one person, it's not a quilombo. The idea of quilombo is imagine and escape to create a new world, always together, always in group, always collectively. Because if it's not a collective, it's not a quilombo. So the aspiration of freedom and the possibility of imagining a new society, it was what moved these people to a situation that they didn't know any control. They didn't know what would happen, but they escaped and they created these other societies. And it is really important to Brazilian history. And it can inspire us in this moment where we don't control anything. We don't know what's going to happen with our world. But collectively, in group, we can make together find solutions, find possibilities, create other process of re-existence. And Lélia Gonzalez is another black leader in Brazil, and she created this idea of an América Latina more than 10 years before the Black Atlantic, written by Paul Gilroy here in UK, which is a very important book. But Lélia Gonzalez was defending the idea of an América. América would be an America African in its future, always in process and faced with the struggles, possibilities and contingents in each time and space. She understood the importance of the culture and not only the resistance made by the black population in Americas, but the process of re-existence in the 1980s. She wrote in this article, she defended the idea of an América Latina. The idea of the Portuguese would be the language spoken in Brazil. The very language spoken in Brazil would not be Portuguese, would be Portuguese. And I tell you something, the second time I went to Africa, I went to Cape Verde to launch my book and to give a lecture at the university there. And when I was arriving to the university, the first person who talked to me was a student, a young man, and he came to me and asked, "Professor, you are going to talk in Brazilian, right?" And I said, yes. It was the first time I thought about this, that in Brazil we speak Brazilian, we don't speak Portuguese. Why? Because, think with me, we represent the reality based on the experiences. So we represent the reality through language based on our experience of being a human being in some social context, historical context. So the experience of being a Brazilian is not the same experience of being a Portuguese person. So the importance of the African language and the native Brazilian language, the indigenous language in the very language we speak in Brazil is amazing. It's something that if you are not used to understand Portuguese, if you go to Brazil and spend 1 month in Brazil and then you go to Portugal, you think it's another language. To the Cape Verdeans, it is another language. They say that we speak Brazilian. We not speak Portuguese. And this is the Portuguese of Lélia Gonzalez. And why is this? Because the re-existence of the black population historically in Brazil made it possible for us to speak the very language we speak. We don't use the word Benjamin to call the youngest of the family, how they say in Portugal. In Brazil, the youngest of the family is, if there is a Brazilian, you know, how we call the youngest of the family? Caçula. Caçula. Caçula comes from where? Comes from Quimbundo, an African language. Because the caçula of the family is the youngest. It's not the Benjamin like it is in Portugal. So we were able, the black population was able to keep their culture, to keep their words, their ways to see the world, and reimagining, re-existing. They made it possible for us now to speak the very language we speak in Brazil. And this is people, the black people were talking and understanding that the importance of this cultural process through education for a long time, as I told you. In the 19th century, we can find schools made by black people in Brazil. I brought this example, for me it's very important. The Clarim da Alvorada, it's a black newspaper created in 1924 in São Paulo, and they were in 1929 trying to create this Congress of the Black Youth in Brazil. This Congress of the Black Youth inspired in the movement of the black population in different parts of the world. For example, in 1910, it was created in South Africa, the African National Congress, which eventually became a political party. So inspired in this black movement, this transnational black movement, the black movement in Brazil was trying to create a political organization in the 1920s to make it possible through education to get a better condition of life. So they were really worried and they were spending energy to make it possible for the black population to access the educational system in Brazil. It was a Eurocentric educational system, but they were trying to make it possible for the the black population to have education in Brazil. Because in many parts of Brazilian society, the black population simply could not attend schools. It was prohibited in many parts. For the enslaved people during the slavery system, the enslaved people would not be able to attend school to learn. It was prohibited. But in many parts of the Brazilian society, even after the abolition of slavery, there were some laws, some decrees, state decrees, making it really hard for the black population to access education. But I'm using this expression from Nilma Gomes, another intellectual and leader of the black movement in Brazil. Nilma Gomes says that the black movement is educating the Brazilian society. They were fighting for accessing education, but at the same time, through the political struggle, the anti-racist struggle, the black movement has been educating the Brazilian society for the race relations. So since the 19th century, in face of racial hierarchies, the violence and discrimination, black people in Brazil organized, created schools in different institutions, and through the political struggles against racism, produced culture, which has been educating Brazilian society for the race relations through times. And I brought this example. That same organization I told you before, the Movimento Negro Unificado, in its Charter of Principles, they called for the reassessment of the role of blacks in Brazil's history. So in 1978, they were in understanding the importance of the history teaching, of the curricula, to make it possible for the society to understand that the black lives matter. So they were trying to change education, not only accessing education as it was in the early 20th century, but in that period they were fighting for transforming education through especially the area of history, the importance of memory, again, memory, because memory is the basis for the history and it's the basis for the identity. We all develop identities, social, cultural identities through our life. And it is based in the memory, the individual, the family, and the collective, the social memory we have been touched through our life. We develop this identity. So memory and history are really, really important, as I told you before, for the struggle against racism, not only in Brazil, but in the African diaspora. This is a photo, a picture from the National Convention of the Black, trying to influence the constitutional process after the finish of the military dictatorship we had in Brazil. It was 1986. We were a military dictatorship, a civil military dictatorship until 1985. So we were preparing a new constitution, a democratic one, and the black movement was there trying to influence, to creating other possibilities. And this is the basis of the federal law 10639 which made it mandatory. It was created and signed by Lula in 2003, and it made it possible. Changing culture in Brazil, which is going on until today, as you are going to see. This is very important. This federal law made it mandatory the teaching of African and Afro-Brazilian histories and culture in all schools of Brazil. This is amazing. This is something huge. But it was created by the Black movement through time, including the law was written by an organization of the Black movement, and it was signed by Lula in 2003. This is another picture of a manifestation of the Black movement in 1995. It was remarkable because it was the first time that in that period, after the military dictatorship in 1995, the Brazilian president received the Black movement, and the Black movement gave him a document with some demands. One of these is the development of affirmative action for blacks to access vocational courses and universities in areas of technology. So they were struggling to not only access the basic school, but also this place of power, which is the university. And they were able to achieve that. There is a federal law from 2012, signed by President Dilma, which reserved part, 50% of the seats in public universities, in federal universities, which are the most prestigious universities in Brazil. 50% are reserved by people who studied in public high schools, and part of this to black and indigenous people. So it has been changing the university. I became a professor at the Federal University of Rio, which is one of the most prestigious universities in Brazil, in 2009. And my students were white. I used to have 3, 2, sometimes 4 black students in a population which is made up in majority of black people. As I told you, 56% of the Brazilian population is black people. And in my seats, in my classes, I would have 2, 3, 4 black students. Nowadays it's different. More than half part of my students in the Federal University of Rio are made up of black people. So it's changed. It is something really remarkable. So to finish, I'm going to finish in 2 minutes. I did this research in 2018 with my group of research. I have a lot of graduate students, and we together created a digital form, and we went to 7 different states in Brazil. We got some money, some funds from different institutions, because we were trying to understand what would be the Black movement in 2018. And we did some questions, and this digital form was filled out by 261 leaders of the Black movement all around Brazil. And we asked it in this form, in your opinion, what is the most significant achievement of the anti-racist struggle in Brazil? And they said, almost 90% of them said that the quotas for blacks, these affirmative actions to make it possible for the black population to access the universities, was the most significant achievement of the anti-racist struggle. And in second place was the federal law, which made it mandatory the teaching of Afro-Brazilian history and culture in schools. Like William Prescott said, the importance of memory, the importance of history to change, to transform the realities and to build a new future. So it was the second most significant achievement of the Black movement. And we asked it also, in your opinion, what is the most urgent struggle of the black population today? What's more urgent for them? In the first place was the end of the police violence against black population. So you see that numbers of black young men being murdered every day, each 26 minutes in Brazil. So 83% of the black militants says that it was the most urgent. But the second most urgent struggle for the black movement is the implementation of the law that made it mandatory the teaching of African and Afro-Brazilian history and culture. So you see how important to access education, but not to access, to transform education is to the black movement in Brazil. I'm going to finish. So my final considerations, I hope we have the time to talk after leaving the room. In my point of view, the achievements of the black movement in Brazil, producing culture through the political struggle, as would say Amilcar Cabral, especially in the area of education, even with all the racial violence during this long 20th century of the color line in Brazil, makes it one of the most successful social movements in Latin America. I would like to talk more about this with you. But we are talking about 35 years of the first really democratic constitution created in Brazil. And 20 years after this federal law that made it mandatory, the teaching of African and Afro-Brazilian history and culture. So I would finish with this sentence from Jurema Werneck, which is another black leader of Brazil. She says, "Our step comes from far away." So I was remembering William Prescott and that sentence about the memory, about how the people fought, about how the people were strong, trying not only to survive, but to creating other worlds, other possibilities of being a human and in that violence period of the slavery system. Our steps come from far away, and they will not stop here. Thank you.